tonight, and this totally unnecessary, totally self-created crisis could come to an end today. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I would ask Mr. Skett to speak up to 20 minutes as in the morning business.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, we are 5 days into the government shutdown, but unfortunately there has been no progress on resolving this issue. Now, I disagree with some policies championed by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. And indeed, I sometimes disagree with the President and members of my own party on specific policy prescriptions. Case in point, raising the student loan interest rates and the so-called Jobs Act. In both cases, I tried to make my best argument on the merits of the issue, and then we voted, moved on, and I'm still working to try to improve both laws. I haven't given up, but I've not shut the government down because my views didn't prevail. And so I say to my colleagues on the other side, the way to change laws that you do not like is not to shut down the government at the expense of your fellow Americans and the expense of our economy. It is try to build consensus and persuade a broad swath of the American people that there is a better way of doing things and make concrete proposals. It's been pointed out many times before that the House of Representatives has attempted to repeal the Affordable Care Act 45 times, at last count, I believe. But I've yet to hear any credible plan put forth to replace it, or strengthen it, or make it work better. And the American people want this effort to succeed. They would like it modified if it needs modification, but they have rejected this attitude of we're just going to strip the whole books of significant legislation and replace it with what? We don't know. That's irresponsible. Now, this Senate, this Congress is a great institution. Our founding fathers in the wisdom set up a system with plenty of room for debate, different points of view, and checks and balances. But checks and balances is not what is happening today. The government has been shut down not because Congress can't agree on levels of funding. We agree. We have actually agreed with the House on their level. The real reason is that some on the other side of the aisle, and I do think it's just a small cadre, have a very different vision about the government itself. And this is not hyperbole. You can recall, we all can recall, during the Republican presidential primaries, you had candidates seeing who could outpromise each other in terms of eliminating aspects of the federal government. They proposed getting rid of the EPA, the Commerce Department, the Department of Education, FEMA, the Department of Energy. Not reforming these agencies, not changing their missions, not making them more efficient, more effective, but just doing away with them. And that spirit is animating the House today, unfortunately. I'm particularly glad that that view did not prevail in the last election, because these agencies are vital to all Americans. Looking back in Rhode Island, we were victims of serious historic flooding over the last several years. If FEMA was not there to step in and help us, we'd still be trying to pull ourselves together. As a small state, like Connecticut, like other states, we wouldn't have the resources to do it. We saw the same thing with Hurricane Sandy. They were there, helping efficiently, effectively. And those are one of the agencies that my colleagues are not allowing to operate today. Many of the small business men and women in my community, manufacturers, et cetera, have been aided immensely by the Department of Commerce. That's something else that was on the hit list during the presidential primaries by Republican candidates. And those of us who enjoy clean water, fresh air, and the importance of a healthy environment, i.e. every American, even if they don't notice it or admit it, their health and the health of their children would be jeopardized severely if EPA was eliminated. Now, there are calls repeatedly to make it more efficient, more effective, make it more businesslike, and those calls have to be recognized and heeded. But the notion that we just wipe it away and the private markets, private self-interest will ensure that our air is clean, our water is clean, our health is protected. That's not something that I think is either realistic or indeed even something that's arguable. There's room in this country for a range of views. And I recognize that many of my colleagues who consider themselves members of the Tea Party are simply doing their best to represent views of those who sent them here. But I would hope that everyone who has been entrusted with the responsibility of government can work together to at least make the government function, i.e. to stay open. That, I think, is a basic responsibility that our constituents entrusted us with when they sent us to Washington. There's nothing patriotic about shutting down the government, putting hundreds of thousands of people out of work, and potentially forcing our country into default. And the hundreds of thousands out of work are not just government employees. As my colleague from Connecticut pointed out, defense contractors now are beginning to furlough workers. These industries are the heart and soul of so many communities. And when these jobs are lost, there is a multiplier effect. These are the good jobs, but it affects the entire community. And this cascading series of economic problems will get worse each day we keep this government closed. Both sides need to work together. But we have already significantly compromised on our side. Again, as the senator from Connecticut pointed out, we are voting for a continuing resolution at the House level, not our level, a multi-billion-dollar gap. We've accepted that, at least for the interim period, the 6 weeks or so of the continuing resolution. We accept the House's position. And for many of us who've been arguing vociferously to end the sequestration, to increase spending, to increase investment, this was a significant compromise. We're not seeing that reciprocated on the other side. It's my way or the highway. Stop Obamacare or nothing gets done. Government doesn't work and we will default on our credit. That is reckless, irresponsible, and does not serve the interests of those who sent us here. It's time for those who are proposing these wild plans of shutting down the government if they don't get exactly what they want to grasp the reality of the situation. We cannot keep this government closed. This closure will last as long as Speaker Boehner wants it to. He can, under the rules of the House, call this bill up within hours, or perhaps less. Or Republicans can join Democrats and sign a discharge petition to bring it to the floor regardless of the Speaker's position. Those are two paths that should be taken immediately to open up this government. Now, we all have a shared responsibility to govern. And as I sense it, one of the basic rationales of this government is keep the lights on, keep people working. Let's get to the difficult negotiations of how we improve efficiency, how we improve operations, but we have a responsibility to keep our government open, to open it and then keep it open. And the longer this shutdown drags on, the more people are affected. Cancer patients, young mothers, scientific researchers, federal employees, people who take prescription drugs, all are being negatively impacted. Government contractors are being laid off. So let us work together and reopen the government for business. Let's continue to debate the issues. We have many issues that we can debate, but not under the sort of Damocles of a government that is closed and an economy that is beginning to lose more and more of its momentum and strength. That just harms the American people, irresponsibly and recklessly, for very narrow, self-interested principles. Now, there's also another aspect here, too. It's not just this government shutdown, but we are coming perilously close to the potential default on the debt of the United States. Now, the government closure is affecting our economy dramatically. A default on a debt could be catastrophic. And there's a growing risk that this brinksmanship on the part of the Republican Party could force us to that default. We are only 12 days away from a potential default because the Tea Party Republicans would rather play with their games over the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, than choose to do what we've always done, pay our bills. Not borrow more money to spend more. This is because we have to pay for those things we all agreed on, Republicans and Democrats, through congressional appropriations, through legislation creating programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. These are obligations we've incurred, and we won't be able to pay all of them. Indeed, on October 17th, unless my Republican colleagues end their obstruction, the nation will not be able to pay its bills, causing dire consequences for American workers and our economy. Many commentators have pointed out a default will destabilize the national and global economy. It could cause another financial crisis, and over the span of a month cause an estimated $160 billion shortfall of federal spending that would cause a severe economic contraction. If we can't pay our debts, then we will contract activity. That contraction will be multiplied in the economy. Our economic growth will slow. In fact, not only decelerate, it could collapse. Ironically, one aspect of that will almost overnight increase our deficit. As less economic activity produces less revenue, produces more people who are laid off, eligible for unemployment compensation, it is a downward spiral. And economists on both sides agree that it's just the specter of a default that has serious economic consequences. In fact, we've already seen the one-month interest rate on treasuries jump over the 6 months and the year-long rates. The market's already voting. They are nervous. They are nervous that the Republicans will carry out these threats. And you can see it in what they're demanding in order to buy the short-term paper of the United States versus the longer-term paper. And we just have to look back at August 2011 to know that there will be consequences. Back then, the Republicans pushed us perilously close to defaulting on the debt. And that manufactured crisis set back job growth in the economy. The Government Accountability Office estimated that the 2011 debt ceiling crisis cost taxpayers $1.3 billion in that fiscal year. It also rattled American households and created economic uncertainty from June to August 2011. Consumer confidence fell 22%. And I would suspect that as this debate, particularly with respect to the debt ceiling, continues to pick up over the next few days, American consumers will become more and more nervous. It took several months after August 2011 for the recovery of consumer confidence, for people to come back into the marketplace, to begin to participate. Back then, the S&P 500 index of equity prices fell about 17% in that period. And it did not recover to its average over the first half of the year until well into 2012. So you're going to see a market effect. We know that. That was in August 2011. And indeed, I'm concerned that this crisis is even more perilous because the opposition seems to be more intransigent. Those people are saying, there won't be any consequences of default, or repeal of Obamacare is more important than anything else, even the economic well-being of the United States. Now, roughly half of the United States households own stock either directly or indirectly through mutual funds or 401k accounts. So this fall in equity prices, which we saw in 2011, will cut across a wide swath of the American public. In fact, we saw again in 2011, as a result of the approaching and debating the fact that we may or may not pass the debt ceiling, wiped out about $2.4 trillion of household wealth. Now, this decline in wealth leads to the decline in consumption. And consumption, consumer spending, accounts for 70% of our gross domestic product. So just put the links together. People are nervous. They pull back. The economy pulls back. Growth begins to decelerate. In fact, reaching zero or worse. That is demonstrably the effect, in some degrees, from what happened in August 2011, it would likely happen again. And in fact, this time, perhaps worse. And already we're starting to see some of the warning signs. We're seeing banking institutions prepare for the worst. According to the Financial Times on October 3rd, 2013, one senior executive said his bank was delivering 20 to 30% more cash than usual in case panicked customers tried to withdraw funds en masse. The move to source extra cash is a precaution to deal with an unnecessary upturn in demand, banks said. Banks are also holding daily emergency meetings to discuss other steps, including possible free overdrafts for customers relying on Social Security payments from the government. But this potential consumer dash for cash is only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to entirely avoidable self-inflicted economic wounds if we get close to, and certainly if we do not raise the ceiling in default. According to The Economist, the noted British magazine, treasuries are more than 30% of the collateral that financial institutions such as investment banks use to borrow in the $2 trillion tri-party repo market. That's the source of overnight funding for most large financial institutions and many other institutions. A default could trigger demands by lenders for more or different collateral. That might cause a financial heart attack like the one prompted by the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008. We just barely understand the interrelationships of all these different financial instruments and financial markets. But this is not the only financial instrument that could be affected. Money market funds are prime source of investment by thousands of Americans, both institutions and individuals. And according to the Federal Reserve's September 25th, 2013 statistical release on the financial accounts of the United States, money market funds in the second quarter of 2013 hold $449 billion of U.S. Treasuries. Now, back in 2011, Matthew E. Zames, the Chief Operating Officer for J.P. Morgan Chase and the chair of the Treasury Borrowing Advisory Committee, which offers observations to the Treasury Department on the overall strength of the U.S. economy, as well as providing recommendations on a variety of technical debt management issues, wrote to, at that time, Secretary Geithner and expressed concern of a, in his words, Mr. Zames, a run on money market funds, as was the case in September 2008 after the Lehman failure. In the event of a Treasury default, I think, in his words, it is likely that at least one fund could be forced to halt redemptions or conceivably break the buck. Since money fund investors are primarily focused on overnight liquidity, even a single fund halting redemption would likely cause a broader run on money funds. And from the same 2011 Treasury Borrowing Advisory Committee level, I would also note, again, quote, because treasuries have historically been viewed as the world's safest asset, they are the most widely used collateral in the world and underpin large parts of the financial markets. A default could trigger a wave of margin calls and a widening of haircuts on collateral, which in turn could lead to deleveraging and a sharp drop in lending. What he is saying is essentially, not just in the United States, but worldwide, this could have a huge, immediate, unpredictable global effect on markets everywhere, causing deleveraging, causing a sharp drop in lending, causing confusion and uncertainty. And one thing we, I think, should recognize, particularly after the events of 2008, markets do not like uncertainty. And when things are uncertain, they pull back. And if the expectation is it's a declining market, there's a premium for the institution or individual that can get out first. And when they start getting out, people notice. And then you have the stampede to the door. So the consequences that are possible are staggering. And yet we hear so many of our colleagues glibly sort of talking this off as, well, we don't get our way on certain aspects of this bill or that bill, we're going to default on the debt of the United States. I think the approach is very, very dangerous. And we're seeing already some indications in financial markets that these factors are beginning to affect economic behavior. Again, from the Financial Times on October 3rd, money market funds dumped October Treasury bills on Thursday. and the first sign of investor unease that Washington may not raise the federal debt ceiling in the coming weeks and risk triggering a technical default by the United States on its Treasury debt. From the Institute of International Finance this month, a well-respected organization, just when the global economy is showing signs of stabilization, with Europe emerging from recession and geopolitical risks in the Middle East seem to be subsiding, consumer and investor confidence could be tested by a range of political and policy uncertainties. What is truly unprecedented is a possible, but still unlikely, and I hope that's the case, unlikely, combination of government shutdown and failure to lift the current $16.7 trillion debt ceiling by October 17. The impact of such a failure of political leadership on business, consumer, and investor confidence is difficult to say and could lead to further downgrades of the U.S. sovereign debt. Reflecting credit risk, 5-year CDS, credit default swaps, the insurance that financial institutions take out on these instruments, these CDS spreads for the U.S. have risen by 45% in the past 3 weeks to 33 basis points and could test or exceed the previous high of 62 basis points. That is an indication that the market is getting very nervous about what we're doing. These rising rates aren't good for the United States. They mean that the market is beginning to look at default as a possibility, and the risk is being written into the instruments that they are providing in terms of insurance, if you will, on U.S. Treasuries and other securities. Now, on October 17th, the extraordinary measures the Department of Treasury has had to employ since May 19 will be exhausted. The Treasury Secretary has told us that. On that day, Treasury will have to approximately, in their view, $30 billion on hand to meet the government's daily expenditures, which can be as high as $60 billion. That $60 billion figure represents payments for the nation's bills on things like Social Security, Medicare, national defense, and education. However, some Tea Party Republicans have started to dismiss this issue and say, well, we're planning to limit the fallout, and we shouldn't be blamed for it because we have a plan. They call for what they argue prioritization, where some of the U.S. bills are paid and others are not. But their plan for prioritization is just another version of default. Indeed, the House passed legislation that would prioritize payments. However, in a letter to Speaker Boehner, the Department of Treasury made it clear that prioritizing payments, quote, would not protect the full faith and credit of the United States, and that prioritization is simply default by another name. It's shocking to witness the length some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are willing to go in order to win political points and gain negotiating leverage. They are threatening the economic well-being of every American by refusing to do something, at least at this point, as essential as paying the nation's bills. Paying the nation's bills should be a routine matter. There's no alternative. Congress has always done so. Since 1960, Congress has acted to prevent a default on the debt 78 times, 49 of which were under Republican presidents. Indeed, President Reagan said in 1983 that, quote, the full consequences of default, or even the serious prospect of default, by the United States are impossible to predict and awesome to contemplate. And regrettably, because of some, particularly colleagues in the House of Representatives, there is a serious prospect of default, something President Reagan warned us against. And he also, I think, quite rightly pointed out, it's impossible to predict. And the markets, frankly, are much more complicated, much more interrelated, much more driven by technology today than in 1983, decades ago. Automated computerized trading was not a common feature of markets in 1983. Today it is. Today algorithms have got programs that look for declines in products and then begin to sell. Not an individual broker who says, listen, I know this is going to be worked out in a couple hours. It's a machine. And we've seen these machines go haywire. There is a real possibility that initial reaction to a technical default in the debt could trigger some of this trading in a way that even the people who built these elaborate algorithms don't fully understand. This is very serious. more serious today than in 1983. But President Reagan's words were prescient then and decisive then and right then, and they're the same today. So this shouldn't be a negotiating chip, this default. Speaker Boehner's threat to default in order to extract dollar-for-dollar cuts to programs, to make changes in this program, that program, is risking the economic viability of the United States and indeed the world's financial community. Also, the Speaker suggested, well, we've always done it this way. He said every major effort to deal with the deficit over the past 30 years has been tied to the debt limit. It's not supported by the facts. Over the past 30 years, 77% of laws passed by Congress to pay for spending already accrued were not statutorily linked to deficit reductions or budget reform. 77% were simply, we've got to extend the debt ceiling, we'll do it. We always have. Furthermore, several of the deficit reduction measures identified by Speaker Boehner as tied to paying our nation's bills included significant new revenue. According to the U.S. Treasury estimates, the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1990 raised $126.6 billion over 4 years. And the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1993 raised $188 billion in new revenue over 4 years. I don't see the Speaker coming up and saying, we have a plan. We're going to make adjustments here on the spending side and on the revenue side, and then we're going to tie it to the debt ceiling. No. In fact, this discussion of revenue increases or revenue positions, spending cuts, all of this is not appropriate for the debt ceiling discussion. It's appropriate for the conference on the budget. We have had a budget in the Senate since March, and we have been prevented from going to conference with the House Republicans by members on this side. And there is a bipartisan demand, really, because many of my colleagues on the Republican side have asked, suggested that we go to conference, say that's the appropriate way to deal with this issue, not threatening the world and the American people with default on our debts, but doing it in regular order, taking up the budget, talking about revenues, talking about changes to programs, talking about continued efforts to reduce our deficit, talking about growing the economy, because that ultimately is the best way to reduce the deficit. Now, you can't expect, as the Speaker implied in his sort of citing, well, every time we do one of these deficit debt ceilings, we have some revenue, et cetera. That's not going to be the case from what I sense from the other side. So we have, I think, a real challenge before us. And the challenge is that there seems to be this blasé attitude in some respects, particularly on the House, among certain of their members, that so what, we default. Well, other countries have defaulted, and they've seen the consequences. We saw something like it in August of 2011. But Greece, for example, and it's very difficult to compare the two economies, and I don't want to suggest that our experience will mimic their experience. It's a much smaller economy. It does not have an independent currency. It is tied to the euro. But their debt in 2012 was basically challenged. The International Swaps and Derivative Association determined that they had technically defaulted on their sovereign debt. This would trigger credit default swaps being called. One estimate of the net notional value of the Greek credit default swaps at the time was about $3.2 billion. But in that economy, that was a significant number. And according to a Forbes article on March 9, 2012, while no one expects the Greek settlement to have systematic implications, it does set the precedent for any subsequent restructurings, which could take on added importance if big troubled peripherals like Spain or Italy take a turn for the worse. Well, the Greek situation, as I said, is not even closely identical odds. In fact, because of the size of our economy, because of the ubiquity of U.S. treasuries across the globe, and so many different instruments, and so many different institutions, it could be much, much, much worse. But the Greek example does demonstrate there are consequences to default. The Wall Street Journal on September 7th pointed out, since tipping into recession in 2008, Greece's economy has shrunk by more than 20% from its peak, while successive waves of austerity measures since the start of the Greek debt crisis in 2009 have helped push tens of thousands of businesses into bankruptcy and sent unemployment to a record around 27%. And the Pew Center reports that unemployment among young Greeks under 25 years old skyrocketed to 62% in June of 2013. Now, austerity, in some respects, is another word for contracting government spending, contracting government engagement in the economy. Well, this is a mini austerity program for the last 5 days because we have contracted government contributions to the economy. Hundreds of thousands of federal workers furloughed. Additional private sector contractees furloughed. Extraordinary means to shutting down the government. And these measures will lead, I think, inevitably to the contraction we've seen in other places. Holding the full faith and credit of the United States hostage to appease a handful of irresponsible and reckless House members who are fighting battles that have already been lost several times is not what democracy is about. I urge immediate action to get our government up and running and our bills paid. And then we can focus on a more pressing need, creating jobs, opportunity, and prosperities for families in my state of Rhode Island and across this nation. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
I'm grateful to the senior senator from Rhode Island for his statement. I've watched every word of it from my office. He is such a great asset to the state of Rhode Island and our country. His military background and his experience on the banking committee and armed services. Very few people have the wisdom that he has. I would also note with the presiding officer, I also had the good fortune to be able to watch the presiding officer's presentation this afternoon. It was also quite remarkably good. Mr. President, in closing today, I want to read just a very brief statement from a Nevada publication. Headline, Nevada residents are calling their Obama hotline in tears, desperate for health coverage. Uninsured Americans in Nevada are so desperate to get health coverage under Obamacare that many are calling the state's new insurance marketplace in tears. Kevin Walsh, a senior Xerox official who heads a department that's helping some states maintain their online Obamacare marketplace and call centers, told Bloomberg Businessweek that many people had contacted Nevada's Obama hotline with just raw emotion. Within the first hour that the marketplace opened on Tuesday, Nevada has an adult insurance rate of 27%. I'm sorry, an adult uninsurance rate of 27%, the fifth highest in the country. They were calling up saying, can I get my coverage today so I can see my doctor this afternoon? That is in one sense moving but also frustrating because sure, you can sign up, but the coverage won't be effective until January 1st. Uninsured Americans and those with costly or skimpy health plans have been rushing to sign up for health coverage under the law, although technical glitches have delayed enrollment process for some of them. Those who have successfully enrolled say they're pleased with the new coverage they're getting beginning in January. Even some ardent Republicans and Obamacare skeptics who signed up for coverage are admitting that the law will be a financial boon to them and give them peace of mind. Butch Matthews, a lifelong Republican and initial proponent of repealing the law, said this, I will end up saving $13,000 a year in medical costs. I'm still a very strong Republican, but I'm so happy that this came along. Mr. President, it's this way all over America this week. As I've heard others say here on the floor, and I learned personally from a man that started Google. They had problems when that started. They didn't believe that many people were interested in the information that they could give. It's about 9 million people this week have got online to find out about this Obamacare. Mr. President, this has been very, very successful. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that at a time to be determined by me, with the concurrence of Senator McConnell, the Senate proceed to executive session to consider calendar numbers 206, 207, that there be 30 minutes for debate equally divided in the usual form. The Upon the use or reading back of that time, the Senate proceed to vote with no any action or debate on the nominations in the order listed. The motion be considered made and laid on the table with no intervening action or debate, that no further motion be in order, that any related statements be printed on the record, and that President Obama be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate then resume legislative session.
Without objection.
There are two bills at the desk due for second reading.
Clerk will read the titles of the bills for the second time.
H.R. 3230, an act making continuing appropriations for a government shutdown and so forth and for other purposes. House Joint Resolution 72, making continuing appropriations for veterans benefits for fiscal year 2014 and for other purposes.
In order to place these bills on the calendar under Rule 14, I would like to do that, but I object to any further proceedings to both these measures.
The objection having been heard, the bills will be placed on the calendar.
Mr. President, I understand that there are three more measures on the desk due for their first reading.
Clerk will read the titles of the measures for the first time.
H.R. 3223, an act to provide for the compensation of furloughed federal employees. House Joint Resolution 75, making continuing appropriations for the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for women, infants, and children for fiscal year 2014 and for other purposes. House Joint Resolution 85, making continuing appropriations for the Federal Emergency Management Agency for fiscal year 2014 and for other purposes.
I now ask for second reading, but object to my own request to all three of these measures.
Objection having been heard on block. The bills will receive their second reading on the next legislative day.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent when the Senate completes its business day to adjourn at 2 p.m. on Monday, October 7th. Following the prayer and the pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired. The journal proceedings be approved to date. Time for the two leaders be reserved for the use later in the day. And that following any leader remarks, the Senate be in a period of morning business for debate only until 5 p.m. The senators permitted to speak for 10 minutes each. That at 5 p.m. the Senate proceed to executive session to consider calendars number 204 and 205 as provided under previous order.
Without objection.
There will be a roll call vote then, Mr. President, at 5:30 on Monday. Mr. President, if there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask it adjourn under the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until 2 p.m. on Monday.
As the Senate's gavelled out, members spent most of the last few days taking the floor to speak about the government shutdown. Off the floor, lawmakers in both parties still looking for ways to resolve their differences over